Hi guys, today we're going to watch another Lemmino video. This one is called The Search of DB Cooper. Let's watch.
Just let me know.
Liking the track.
A daring parachute escape from a flying 727 somewhere between wings.
Search was made of the plane immediately. We don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went. I expect that we'll
How could they know nothing about him?
find him or find out what happened.
Before we get in the video, I've seen a few of his videos. He does wonderful documentaries. I recommend you supporting him on Patreon.
In the afternoon of November the 24th, 1971, a middle-aged man carrying a briefcase walked into the Oakland International Airport and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. The man identified himself as Dan Cooper, and along with 36 other passengers and a crew of 6, he soon boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 305.
Dude, how easy was back
Once
then to
aboard,
get
Cooper made himself comfortable in the middle of the last row of
a
seats
ticket,
on the right side of the
plane
cabin.
ticket.
He ordered a drink and had a smoke, because this was the 70s. Once the flight was cleared for departure, Cooper turned around and handed an envelope to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Inside the envelope was a note featuring a handwritten message stating he had a bomb. Schaffner reluctantly sat down beside him and glimpsed what appeared to be 8 sticks of dynamite inside his briefcase. Cooper's demand
before 9/11 there wasn't any
he
checks
wanted
in the briefcase,
$200,000
nothing.
in cash and 4 parachutes.
Only
He also demanded a
$200,000?
fuel truck to stand ready to refuel the aircraft once they landed in Seattle.
I mean,
Should they
back then
fail to
was
comply with his
a lot of
demands,
money.
he threatened to, quote, do the job.
Ooh.
Once the flight was airborne, Schaffner went to inform the cockpit crew, while another flight attendant by the name of Tina Mucklow remained by Cooper's side. By using a telephone in the rear of the cabin, Mucklow acted as an intermediary between Cooper and the rest of the flight crew for the remainder of the hijacking. For the next hour and a half, Flight 305 maintained a holding pattern near Seattle, while local and federal authorities scrambled to procure the ransom as well as the 4 parachutes. 10,000 $20 bills were collected from a local bank, while the owner of a nearby skydiving school supplied the chutes.
They already got the
At
demands.
5:45 p.m., more than 2 hours past its scheduled arrival, Flight 305 finally touched down in Seattle. By this point, it was well after sunset, and the aircraft was brought to a remote section of the tarmac. Once the flight came to a stop, both the ransom and the parachutes were handed over to Mucklow, who then brought them back aboard. In exchange, Cooper permitted 2 of the flight attendants, as well as all the passengers, to
thank God.
disembark, many of whom had not yet realized the flight had been hijacked.
Oh my god.
With the ransom paid and only 4 crew members remaining on board, Cooper told Mucklow to inform the captain that he wanted to fly to Mexico City. They were to fly with the landing gear
Interesting
down,
demand.
the flaps at 15 degrees and below 10,000 feet. The
Wait,
lights
he's
in
the
the cabin
pilot?
were to be switched off,
Good, does he
and
know
the aft
this-
stairway, which
these
opens
things?
from the underbelly of the fuselage,
He
was
knows
to remain
much
sealed.
information about planes.
2 of
Maybe he
Cooper's
did
demands
this
could not be satisfied.
another time.
First of all, the flight configuration he'd requested would not allow for a non-stop flight to Mexico City. As such, Cooper proposed a refueling
So
stop
I
in
don't think
Phoenix,
he's a pilot.
Yuma, or Sacramento before they all agreed on Reno, Nevada. Second of all, it was not possible to depart with the ventral staircase extended. Cooper agreed to retract the stairs on the condition that Mucklow
I think he
remained by his
maybe
side
watched too
and
many
taught him
movies.
how to extend them once the plane was airborne. Parked for nearly 2 hours due to complications with refueling, Flight 305 was back in the air by 7:36 p.m. Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to head for the cockpit and that from this point onwards, he was not to be disturbed. The last time she saw Cooper, he was standing in the middle of the aisle as
Oh my
though
god, he
was
got away.
preparing
I
to
can't
jump.
believe this.
Mucklow joined the rest of the crew, locked the cockpit door behind her, and some 3 hours later, Flight 305 safely landed in Reno. Once the flight came to a stop, the crew carefully ventured into the rear of the cabin, but there was no sign of Cooper nor the bomb. the aft stairway had been extended mid-flight and was slightly damaged upon landing. It seemed there was only one explanation for the hijacker's absence. At some point between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had strapped on a parachute, walked down the stairs,
Dude, that's
and
insane.
leaped into the dark of night.
That's insane. So wait, they found... So there weren't any cameras? Maybe he got away.
As soon as it became clear that Cooper was no longer on board, dozens of FBI agents converged upon the aircraft, only to discover a disappointing amount of physical evidence. A black clip-on tie, 8 cigarette butts, and 2
So there could get any DNA? Or back then there wasn't any DNA?
of the 4 parachutes were all that Cooper left behind.
Oh, he left the
Evidently, he
parachute.
brought the ransom and briefcase along with him. In interviews conducted on the night of the hijacking, Cooper was described by the crew and passengers as a white male with brown eyes and dark hair. He appeared to be in his mid-40s and wore a dark trench coat, a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and dark shoes.
So he did know how
He'd
to
also
get...
donned a pair of sunglasses.
How to
Based on
lay
this
low.
description, the FBI produced the first of several composite sketches. Before they could mount a search, however, the FBI had to figure out when
That's a very
Cooper
broad
abandoned the
description.
ship. But that was easier said than done. None of the 4 crew members witnessed Cooper jumping from the plane, nor did the pilots of 2 fighter jets which escorted the flight between Seattle and Reno, which is not all too surprising given it was the middle of the
They
night.
hit her.
Although the flight crew did report something odd. The last communication with the hijacker occurred at approximately 8:05 p.m. when the crew used the intercom to offer assistance, which Cooper declined. Within the next 10 minutes, the crew experienced what they described as an oscillation or vibration of the aircraft. At the time, the crew suspected it might have been produced by Cooper's jump and a subsequent recreation
So they couldn't inform nobody about this? They have 2 planes flying around them.
of the hijacking supported that conclusion. Okay, so that took care of the when, but what about the where? While Cooper was very explicit about the flight's configuration and destination, he never specified any kind of route. In fact, Cooper grew so impatient with the slow refueling in Seattle that he dismissed the captain's request to file a flight plan and simply told him to, quote, get the show on the road.
So I
the
think he
captain chose
didn't
to
have
fly along
any
an airway known as Victor 23 without any input from Cooper.
pilot
By using Victor
knowledge.
23 as a guide, authorities estimated the most probable location of the flight
Also,
and
that he didn't get
approximate
any
time to
far.
jump was about 40 kilometers north of Portland. And so, at the break of dawn,
40
the
kilometers,
FBI
about
mounted an impressive search
20 miles,
operation
30
using
miles.
helicopters, airplanes, and ground troops. The problem was, even if the estimated
So they
layout
did
point
know the
was
drop zone.
accurate, Cooper's eventual landing or drop zone was far more difficult to pinpoint. The loosely defined search area covered a vast stretch of mountainous wilderness occluded by a dense forest, so it was truly like finding a
God
needle in
damn.
a haystack. Apart from the difficult terrain, the search was further complicated by low temperatures and inclement weather,
Oh, in
which
winter.
persisted for days. Despite their best efforts, authorities never
Maybe
managed to find a
he- maybe
single
he
trace
died.
of Cooper, nor the items he'd brought along with him.
So it's possible back then to hijack a plane and nobody will find you. Interesting. Oh yeah.
Having made little to no progress by early December, the FBI turned their attention to the $200,000 ransom. The money had been collected from the Seattle First National Bank, which maintained a ransom package of $250,000 just for such an occasion. Because of this, the serial numbers of the $10,020 banknotes given to Cooper had been documented in advance.
That's a really smart
A
move.
list of which were quickly made available to financial institutions, government agencies, and the general public. The intention was to make it
Very
as
smart.
difficult as possible for Cooper to spend his money. Northwest Airlines and several newspapers even began to offer rewards to anyone who could find a note with a matching serial number. In spite of these efforts, no one ever did. That is
What
until
the-
nearly a decade later. In early 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was building a campfire on a small beach in southern Washington. As he was digging into the sand, Ingram discovered 3 bundles of cash totaling $5,880. Having heard about the
So he did drop in this area. Do you know?
infamous skyjacking,
Maybe he dropped in the water, lost the money. Maybe he drowned.
Ingram's parents brought the severely degraded bundles to the FBI. The notes were promptly inspected, and sure enough, the serial numbers matched those
Oh,
of
they
the
match.
ransom. Once the excitement subsided, however, the money managed to raise far more questions than it answered, the most significant of which was how? How did the money end up so far away from the drop zone?
Oh, another 20
Looking
kilometers.
at this map,
30
it might be
kilometers.
tempting to think that Cooper simply dropped some of the money, which then fell into the Lewis River. The bundles could then have been carried further downstream by the Columbia River before finally being washed ashore at Tina Bar, which is the name of the beach. Tina Mucklow, Tina Bar. Coincidence? Yeah, coincidence.
Yeah, just a
Anyway, the
coincidence.
problem with this idea is that the Columbia River flows in the opposite direction. This has led some, including members
So maybe
of
he
the
dropped
FBI,
farther.
to re-evaluate initial drop zone assessment. For instance, if the drop zone was much further southeast,
Maybe
close
he
to a river
dropped
called the
there.
Washougal River, it is conceivable, albeit improbable, that the money floated all the way down to Tina Bar.
Washington, Washougal.
Alternatively, the bundles may have simply
Interesting
landed
names.
on the beach if the flight path was further to the west.
Yeah.
Even so, natural explanations struggle
he
to
dropped
explain
here.
how 3 independent, potentially free-falling and/or free-floating bundles of cash ended up at the exact same place on the same beach. To complicate matters, sediment from the riverbed was
I think maybe somebody found them and buried them there because he couldn't do anything with them, with the money, because they were searched by the FBI. I think maybe he died.
excavated
Someone
and
found
dumped
the
onto
money.
Tina Bar as part of a dredging operation in 1974. And according to one analysis, the money was discovered above this layer of sediment. If true, that would mean the money came to
No,
rest at
somebody
Tina Bar
borrowed them.
sometime after
Buried them.
1974. But a re-examination of that analysis found that what was believed to be a layer of deposited sediment might actually have been a perfectly natural layer of clay. Not only that, but the sediment was clearly dumped some distance away from where the money was discovered. Furthermore, when Ingram discovered the bundles, the rubber bands which held them together were still intact. This is significant because experiments conducted in 2009
Oh, yeah.
revealed that this brand of rubber bands
These
cannot
rubber bands
withstand
decay in a
exposure
few
to
years.
open air or water for more than a year. So,
I know you have to change them every year.
unless the bundles were somehow protected from the elements, they must have become buried at Tina Bar within a year of the hijacking. The most probable explanation,
I know that in the hot days in the cars they may just melt.
therefore, seems to be that Cooper or someone else deliberately buried the money.
Yeah.
Did Cooper survive and bury the money himself? Did someone else bury the money after stumbling upon
Yeah, I think somebody found the money and buried there because the FBI were looking for the serial numbers. Couldn't do anything with them.
Cooper's remains? If there is an explanation which does not require human intervention, it's managed to elude investigators for decades. Suffice it to say, this is a mystery within a mystery. Since Ingram's discovery in 1980, both Tina Bar and the grounds around the Washougal River have been subjected to numerous searches, but to date, there's been no sign of Cooper, nor the rest of the money. From the very beginning, it was assumed by many that Cooper did not survive his daring escape. It would not make for a very thrilling conclusion to the
I just
story,
think
but
that
that's the
too.
thing about stories.
I
They're
don't think
usually
he
far more
survived.
exciting than reality. While there is no hard evidence for nor against Cooper's survival, the assumption that he fell to his death is not without merit. When Cooper leaped into the darkness, Flight 305 was plowing through a frigid rainstorm at roughly 170 knots, 10,000 feet above southern Washington. The wind was so violent that it ripped out a placard from the aft stairway, which was later recovered
So I
in
don't think he
1978,
survived.
almost directly below the estimated flight path. To say that Cooper was not dressed for the occasion would be an understatement. The ground beneath him, meanwhile, was obscured by multiple layers of clouds, which likely means that Cooper jumped without knowing his precise location. Even if he could see the ground and had a specific drop zone in mind, the parachute he selected was non-steerable, meaning he would not have been able to steer his descent towards a specific landing spot, thus precluding any potential coordination with an accomplice stationed on the ground.
So he cannot steer it, he cannot see when he landed. I think he died.
While Cooper expressed some familiarity with parachutes, his actual competence level is up for debate. It's widely believed that Cooper demanded 2 pairs of parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, to make the authorities believe that he intended to take a hostage. That is precisely what happened, as the FBI contemplated, but eventually decided against sabotaging the chutes, as they did not want to risk the life of
they want to rig them.
But in their haste to obtain them, they unintentionally provided Cooper with a non-functional dummy chute intended for training purposes. This mishap seems to have gone unnoticed by Cooper, because that dummy chute was one of the 2 missing from the plane.
He wasn't that smart.
Not only that, but Cooper chose the older and technically inferior parachute out of the 2 primary chutes provided. So in both cases, it seems like Cooper made the worst possible choice.
So why would you take a non-steering parachute? I don't know.
But there are other ways to interpret this information. For instance, it's possible that Cooper used the dummy chute not as a reserve, but as a means to secure the bag of money.
And so he lost the money.
That's precisely what Cooper tried to do with the functional reserve chute. First, he tried to place the money in the chute's canopy before removing some of the suspension lines and wrap them around the bag. Perhaps he used the dummy chute for a similar purpose. And Cooper's decision to use the older primary chute is not necessarily an indication of inexperience. It could also be a sign of familiarity, because the chute he left behind was a civilian luxury chute, while the one he used was a military chute. The argument is that Cooper might have been trained as
maybe he was a paratrooper
and chose the older military chute because that's the one with which he was most familiar. And there is at least one other reason to suspect that Cooper had a military background. While the flight was in a holding pattern near Seattle, Cooper mentioned that the McCord Air Force Base was only 20 minutes away from the Seattle-Tacoma Airport.
How would he know that?
That was an accurate assessment and might suggest a military background.
Yeah,
Apart from the
military
potential
parachute,
military connections,
military
Cooper may
base.
even have had links to the Central Intelligence Agency.
What?
You see, the type of aircraft which Cooper chose to hijack, a Boeing 727, was also used by the CIA to covertly drop agents and supplies during the Vietnam War, a task for which the Boeing 727 was uniquely qualified due to its distinctive aft stairway. So
Maybe
it's very
was
safe
a
to assume that Cooper
CIA
chose to
agent?
hijack a Boeing 727 specifically because it provided a relatively safe means of escape. Whether he learned of this from the CIA or came to that conclusion independently is another question. However, the fact that Cooper chose to hijack a flight operated by Northwest Airlines was apparently random chance. When Tina Mucklow asked Cooper about his motives, he responded, "It's not because I have a grudge towards your airline, it's just because I have a grudge." He further clarified
Maybe he
that
was a
Flight
pilot.
305 just happened to be in the right place
Fired
at the
pilot?
right time. Even so, it's clear that Cooper came prepared. He seemed to know a great deal about aircraft and aviation, he appeared to be familiar with the local terrain, he maintained a low profile to avoid a panic, he covered his eyes with a pair of glasses to conceal his identity, he left very little evidence behind, and he demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he was taken
evidence.
hostage.
You couldn't
was
get any
even
DNA
cunning
from
enough to
the
reclaim the note which he'd initially
cigarette
given
butts.
to Florence Schaffner. Apart from the name he wrote on his plane ticket, there are no other samples of Cooper's handwriting. But for all his planning and cunning, it seems Cooper did not give enough thought to his eventual escape. Not only did he fail to specify a route, but he was forced to make a
If
last-minute
he was a
destination
pilot, why
change from Mexico
didn't
City
he
to
do that?
Reno. He could have demanded more appropriate parachuting equipment like a pair of boots, a
or
helmet,
steering
and a jumpsuit.
parachute.
He could even have specified the ransom to be delivered in larger denominations to make it lighter and less cumbersome to carry. Presuming he did survive the fall and made it safely to the ground, he may then have had to make his way through a dense, partially snow-covered forest in nothing but loafers and a trench coat
I don't think he survived the winter forest. Cold, rainy. I don't think he survived.
in late November. I get the distinct impression that Cooper's escape was much more of a leap of faith than a carefully executed jump. On the other hand, authorities never received a missing persons report matching the description of Cooper in the wake of the hijacking. This might suggest that Cooper did survive and that he swiftly and quietly resumed his normal routine. Furthermore, other hijackers
Maybe he
have
lost the
performed
money.
similar stunts, and many of them did survive even if they were quickly apprehended. Finally, the simplest explanation for how 3 bundles of cash ended up in a bar is human intervention. At the end of the day, most
I think he lost the money in the dummy shoot. He survived, maybe. Then he go and live his life.
of this is based on nothing but supposition. Without any concrete evidence of Cooper's demise, it leaves the door wide open to the far more exciting proposition that he did, in fact, survive.
Oh,
By
he
the time
did have
the flight
suspects.
end of the hijacking, the FBI had already begun to investigate a few potential suspects. Among them was a man in Portland with initials DB and surname Cooper. This Cooper was quickly eliminated as a suspect, but due to a mix-up by the press, the name Dan Cooper was confused for DB Cooper, and the rest is history. While Dan Cooper is most likely a
So,
pseudonym, there
the
is
fake
a
news
comic
started
book
back then.
series of the same name. The comic is written in French and centers around a Canadian pilot named Dan Cooper. While the comic was not
So the
translated
name is
into English
fictional.
nor sold in the United States before 1971, it
Smart
was
move.
available in Canada, which has a large French-speaking population. Given that American and Canadian accents can be difficult to distinguish, it's possible that Cooper,
Maybe
who
he
was
was
described
Canadian.
as having no discernible accent, was a bilingual Canadian. This might even be supported by something that Cooper might have said. You see, when the captain relayed Cooper's demands to air traffic control, he used the phrase negotiable American currency. It seems doubtful that an American citizen would specify American currency, so perhaps Cooper was not American. The problem is, we don't know if this is a direct quote from Cooper or paraphrasing by the captain. For instance, notes taken by the crew during the hijacking merely contain the phrase negotiable currency, while testimonies provided by the crew after the hijacking include phrases like $200,000 in cash and circulated US currency. So Cooper might have been Canadian, and he might have taken his name from the Dan Cooper comics, just as he might have been American and might have taken his name from something or someone else. Nearly half a century has gone by since the hijacking took place, and in that time thousands of suspects have been questioned and investigated. It would obviously be impossible to cover all of them here, but let's take a look at some of the people that at some point or another have been suspected of being DB Cooper. Robert Rackstraw first became a suspect in 1978, and on the surface he seems
does
like
look
a
like
solid
him.
candidate. He was a decorated army
military.
paratrooper and helicopter pilot. He had experience with explosives. He had an extensive criminal record. He had an uncle named John Cooper who was an avid skydiver. He was expelled from the army only months before the hijacking, which might suggest a
Motive.
motive. After all,
Yeah.
the hijacker did say he had a grudge. When confronted by journalists and private investigators,
does look young.
Rackstraw would neither confirm nor outright deny that he was DB Cooper. Instead, he'd say things like, "I could have been," or "I would not discount myself." On the other hand, Rackstraw had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not. More significantly, Rackstraw was only 28 years of age
Yeah, I
at
was
the
young.
time of the hijacking. This is well outside the range of ages reported by the crew and passengers,
But it does look
most
like
of whom
him.
believe Cooper was in his mid-40s.
Interesting how you
Kenneth Christensen
can't
first
deny.
became a suspect in 2003 when his brother noticed certain parallels between him and Cooper. Christensen had briefly served as a paratrooper in World War II, and since 1953 he'd worked for Northwest Airlines as both
He
a
was a
mechanic
pilot?
and a flight attendant.
Oh.
He was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking. He
Test
was
check.
left-handed, which Cooper might have been. For instance, Cooper used his left hand to interact with his briefcase, and the clip-on tie he left on board was affixed with a tie clasp applied from the left.
Why does
Shortly before
did
he
he leave
died in
that reply?
1984, Christensen had supposedly told his brother, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you."
Well,
After his passing, his family discovered over $200,000 in his bank accounts. To
everything checks.
top it all off, Florence Schaffner stated that photographs of
Yeah,
Christensen
it does
bore a
resemble.
strong resemblance to Cooper.
So
On
everything
the
it's
other hand, Christensen did not match
Sure.
the physical description of Cooper. He was both shorter and lighter. While Schaffner did see a strong resemblance, she remarked that Cooper had more hair, and that is supported by the composite sketches. And there was nothing suspicious about the large sums of money which he'd simply earned by selling land. Richard McCoy first became a suspect in 1972 when he hijacked a Boeing 727 and escaped via the aft stairway, much like D.B. Cooper. Because of the
Copycat?
significant overlap between the two hijackings, some believe they must have been committed by the same person.
Oh,
McCoy
only
used a
1 year
fake name.
later.
He used a fake hand grenade to threaten the crew. He used handwritten notes to issue his demands. Both McCoy and Cooper
think he's
used
a
the phrase
copycat.
"no funny stuff" as a warning to the crew. McCoy demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. McCoy also bailed out the back of the plane once they passed over his hometown in the state of Utah. Apart from the similar modus operandi, McCoy had also served in the Vietnam War as a demolitions expert and a helicopter pilot. McCoy did actually survive the fall and managed to evade authorities for 2 full days before he was apprehended and sentenced
Just
to
in 2
45
days,
years
they
in
caught him.
prison. Before his death in 1974, McCoy refused to confirm or deny that he was D.B. Cooper. On the other hand, McCoy was an avid recreational skydiver and even came prepared with a skydiving helmet and jumpsuit. He gave very specific instructions about the flight path. In addition to the fake hand grenade, McCoy also used an unloaded handgun to threaten the crew. He failed to retrieve one of the notes he'd given to a flight attendant. He was only 29 years of age at the time of the hijacking, and all 3
was too
flight
young,
attendants were
yeah.
quite certain that McCoy was not Cooper. While there are meaningful parallels between these 2 cases,
He does a
McCoy might simply have been a
resembling
copycat
face.
who read about D.B. Cooper in the news.
I think he was a copycat.
Dwayne
So
Weber first became a
we're
suspect
almost to the final, and I don't think they caught him.
in 1995 when, shortly before his death, he supposedly told his wife, "I've got a secret to tell you. I am Dan Cooper."
Whoa.
Following his deathbed confession, Weber's widow recalled a number of fascinating details. She claims to have found a bank bag resembling the one used in the hijacking. She claims Weber had sustained a knee injury after jumping out of a plane. Weber supposedly had a nightmare about leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. And a year before the money was discovered at Tina Bar, Weber had allegedly paid a quick visit to the same location.
So
In
he's
addition,
him.
Weber was a World War II veteran. He had an extensive criminal record. He
Check,
matched the
check.
physical description, and
Check.
he was 47 years old in
Check.
1971. On the other hand, Weber's fingerprints did not match any of the prints collected from Flight 305. Although, to be fair, there's no way to know if any of those prints actually belong
Yeah,
to
maybe he
Cooper.
wore some gloves
Furthermore,
or
Weber's
something.
DNA did not match a DNA sample collected from the tie clasp. But once again, there's no way to know if the DNA on the tie clasp actually came from the hijacker and not someone else. What's so
Why would you have a nightmare about leaving your fingerprints all over a staircase if you didn't wear any gloves? So I think he wore gloves, and maybe he thought that he left some fingerprints. I think he was.
frustrating is that the FBI likely had a much better source of DNA at one point. If you recall, 8 cigarette butts were
Oh, yeah,
collected
no.
from the scene, and there's a good chance they were all suffused with Cooper's
So what's
DNA.
happened with him?
The problem is, that evidence was lost at some point, and has not turned up since.
Very interesting. I think he was.
William Smith first became a suspect in 2018. Smith served in the Navy during World War II and likely had some experience with parachuting. He was 43 years old at the time of the hijacking.
Check.
He had dark brown eyes.
Check.
He matched the physical description. He shared a
Check.
certain likeness with the composite sketches, especially this speculative sketch of an older D.B. Cooper. A student named Ira Daniel Cooper, who was killed in World War II, attended the same high school as Smith.
Dan Cooper.
Smith worked as a yardmaster for a railroad company for most of his life, but in 1970 the company filed for bankruptcy. As a consequence, Smith lost his pension, which might suggest a motive. He could,
Yeah.
for instance, have developed a grudge towards the airline industry for their role in bringing about the downfall of the rail transportation industry. It's
Yeah,
further
that's a motive.
speculated that Smith could have used his knowledge of railroad networks to hop on a train and escape undetected.
That
On
could be
the other
true.
hand, Smith spent his entire life in the northeastern United States. given that the hijacking occurred on the other side of the country and was committed by someone who at least appeared to be familiar with the local terrain. Smith is not the most ideal
Yeah, the
candidate.
guy know the
However, the fact that
military
Smith
base
worked as a
around the
yardmaster is interesting.
airport.
You see, the tie that Cooper left behind was recently examined using an electron microscope, which uncovered various metallic particles. Some of these particles, especially pure titanium, were quite rare in 1971. This might suggest that Cooper worked as a manager at some sort of chemical or metallurgical facility, or possibly a rail yard. If nothing else, I hope this limited selection of suspects illustrates just how difficult it is to be certain when you have so little evidence to work
Okay,
with.
so that's
These
how it's
5
going to end.
individuals look nothing alike, yet any one of them could be D.B. Cooper. Was Cooper really in his mid-40s, or did he simply look old for his age? Did Cooper really serve in the military? Which one of these sketches most closely resemble Cooper? In 2016, the FBI had to admit defeat and officially close down the case. Unless someone stumbles upon Cooper's remains or manages to track down the rest of the money, it seems there is little hope of resolution. Did Cooper survive? I have no idea. But as long as that possibility cannot be dismissed, the legend of D.B. Cooper will no doubt persist.
If you have any more videos to recommend, please leave them in the description down below. I'm interested to know what's your opinion. Did he live? Did he die? Is any one of these 5 suspects? What did you think? Thanks for watching, and see you next time.